We are delighted to have you here, and we're really looking forward to, I'm going to stop talking until that's sorted, there we go, to the culmination of Sarah and my AHLC funded Making Historical Dress Network. We've already had 3 fantastic workshops over the last year where we've been tackling kind of some of the key questions that we think are posed to the field in terms of how we kind of move forward with recreative practice and move forward together. But we're really excited to bring together such an array of fantastic research from all over the world over the course of the festival, which is really the point of the network, to bring us all together, because we're all sort of working on these exciting things. Are we always talking to each other, and how can we find those kinds of threads of consistent questions, consistent problems, and consistent answers, hopefully through coming together and having conversations. So we have 2 very, very jam-packed days ahead of us, with the keynotes in here, the parallel sessions at the other end of the building again, and then the workshops, which are sort of scattered through this floor, the one above and the one below. But we'll do lots of signposting and follow me, so you get to the right place at the right time. And then we will round off the whole event with a round table with our wonderful advisory board, who've been incredibly helpful as we've planned what we want to do with this network. So we've got Bernadette Banner, Professor Jenny Batchelor, who sadly can't be with us today, Hilary Davidson, Paola Hoti-Eriksson, Sophie Pittman, John Stiles, and Evelyn Welsh. We're incredibly grateful to them for all of their help and support so far. Sarah, is there anything you want to add, or should we? No. Okay, then with no further ado, we will kick off with our first keynote of the day, Ulinka Rublack. So Ulinka is Professor of Early Modern History at Cambridge University and Fellow of the British Academy. A monograph, Dürer's masterpiece, Art and Society at the Dawn of the Closed World. Her prize-winning books include Dressing Up, Cultural Identity in Renaissance Europe. She co-edited with Maria Hayward the first book of fashion, the book of clothes of Matthias Schwartz of Bloomsbury in 2015, and Georgia Riello the right to dress gone through legislation. We're delighted to be all in the keynote. That right is going to fit.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Serena and Sarah, for the invitation to speak here. It was amazing to see all the preparations over all these years, first to get the application in for the network, then to see it getting funded, which was terrific, and to flourish in the way it has. So I'm really pleased to be talking about what is both something that relates to my recent work on Dürer and his world, but I suppose also more widely to my approach to the history of reconstruction, which is to take a particularly well-documented historical episode and work with what I then gather as particularly dense, I hope, textual evidence in addition to visual evidence and evidence from objects, and specifically, and how do I actually get up the presentation here? That would be wonderful. Thank you. The way this talk and inquiry came about, which led me into a year-long obsession thinking about Renaissance cloaks. So Evelyn has had an obsession for a while with the Renaissance sleeve and a pioneering article. And similarly, I found that cloaks did not seem to have gotten investigated very much, even though they were the most expensive item of men's wardrobes, certainly. So what led me to this was that Dürer is the famous German Renaissance artist who has left us more writing than any other artist of his time, the early 16th century, apart from Michelangelo. And we get very personal letters. He writes, for instance, to his friend Pirkheimer in Nuremberg when he's in Venice. And what struck me, so this paper really developed from a point of intense curiosity about 2 letters in which he writes to Pirkheimer in Nuremberg and sends him greetings from his cloaks. So animating a range of cloaks. Now, this is the kind of thing we might read over, but we also, I think, should just stop and say there's something really rather odd and peculiar for the time that's going on. So Dürer is animating his cloaks. And the question then for this lecture is, how can we both think about this, solve the puzzle of what's going on, but also use reconstruction and this methodological inquiry that's also object-based in order to reanimate some of the experience for Renaissance men of what it meant to wear a cloak, and perhaps beyond the Renaissance. So with this, I start. So Albrecht Dürer explored the Renaissance body like few others. He was the first to depict an ordinary woman nude, his mother's face as she lay dying, and his own naked body ravaged by illness. His attention to the dressed body was just as acute. Dürer's inscriptions on these pioneering costume studies from the beginning of the 16th century reflected, of course, the humanist views that such styles recorded collective habits. And his eyes in this inquiry were informed by the habit of constantly comparing and translating customs, shaped by his friend's dialogue with antiquity, by his own travel and news he received about an ever-expanded world. And within this, and you see this in his close attention to Ottoman and Eastern European figures, as in the rider here at the back, that meant not just the Americas, but the Ottoman Empire, of course. Attention to dress likewise allowed him to characterize actually more intimately a temperament, a mental state, and a stance on life. So consider this drawing of his brother Endres in a shirt that his wife most likely would have embroidered as a wedding present. Dürer's focus on the shirt in the silver point drawing records the intimacy between the artist and his soft-tempered brother. And I contrast this to Dürer's 1522 woodcut, and this is one of my favorites of his prints of all times. And the first thing to notice about it is really the size. Look at the measurements, and there are 3 times of what you saw earlier as the engraving by him. So in this woodcut, the appearances convey the boldness of Barnbühler, and everything, including the woodcut itself, would have looked outsized. As chief clerk of the Imperial High Court, Barnbühler was a very important lawyer and man of letters at the time. And Dürer shows him wearing an oversized beret, which even cuts, if you can see, across the title of this print, a loose cap underneath, and a simple shirt. He's poorly shaven and does not bother with the usual outer garments. This astonishingly informal print then, in terms of dress, I think medialized the French use of fashion and art to stage their liberality from conventions. Dürer's own career was marked by the imprint of clothing. Most strikingly, in 1506, Dürer, which wrote twice from Venice to his humanist friend Pirkheimer, personifying his 3 coats. He gave details of their origin and manufacture and said they sent their regards. Towards the end of his life in Antwerp in 1521, the German artist spent an extraordinary amount of money on a very precious cloak before returning to Nuremberg. And this was despite the fact that he felt he'd made less money than he had hoped to, and was actually in debt. Dürer also painted himself, as you can see here, in coats several times. And each time they were ingenious. Dress clearly related to his artistic strategies and self-representation in a particularly intense way. And we see this also very interestingly in terms of a projection. So if you look at the adoration of the Magi, painted in 1507, I think, and you see the cape here that Balthasar is wearing. You see, 1504, he painted the altarpiece. You see that it actually seems to relate very closely to capes he presents himself in, although, of course, more eloquent and expensive than in silk for Balthasar. But you see his fascination with drape there, with the beauty of this enfolding and quite unusual garment. So Dürer's animation of his cloaks is particularly surprising, revealing a deep emotional investment in them. I argue that this investment was based on two key conditions. First, it was rooted in the reinvigorated flow of commerce since the late Middle Ages, in the new scope of international trade and the intensified exchange of customs and inventive manufacturing techniques that created a new object world of colors, shapes, and materials. In societies characterized by contested, transforming, melting social hierarchies, these new object worlds powered more varied and novel forms of collective and also of individual display. As a result, clothing became increasingly important in the way people experience themselves, as we all know here, their relationships, society, and politics, and it was an agent of change. Second, the importance of dress was linked to the particular ways in which people and objects were joined at the time. As dress circulated endlessly in rites of passage from childhood onwards to establish and reaffirm friendships and all other kinds of relationships, the adoption, and again, there I'm interested in the psychic relevance of these exchanges, the adoption or rejection of a particular set of clothes could thus be part of both politically and psychologically rich situations. So my lecture explores the entanglement with the power of matter and with things. It is based on the premise that the social is produced and reproduced not only in relation between humans, but also in their relation to non-human entities that they can animate, fill with emotion, and experience as affecting their lives. My particular focus will be on men's outerwear and the construction and impact of what we might call Renaissance virilness. That is a culture of male hierarchical recognition management in which outerwear seems to have functioned as a kind of social skin or material threshold. And I think this is to do with the fact that we can say that coats have a paradoxical quality. They can be used to either theatrically announce a man in modes of attractive signaling. You can see this here, for instance, through bright colors and interesting shapes, or they can, of course, conceal individual bodies and shelter a man in privacy through muted colors and cuts that mold onto the body and function as a protective layer not only against the weather, but also against human-generated forms of intrusiveness, such as gazing, looking. And what's interesting in contemporary menswear is that it often seems to emphasize that need for protection, which has led to developing, for instance, security-orientated techwear as by the brand Skinner, which creates coats as protective garments to keep a wearer's personal data secure, for instance, by including woven pockets from metal that block external trackers. These coats use non-reflective black colors and are advertised for use in dark environments. So again, the camouflage effect of outerwear. And you can see this in a different vein, and I'll explain in a second why I go on about this camouflage effect that can be achieved. So here in this designer wear that uses what's called disruptive coloration, and you can just see how there's no boundary between these bodies. They seem to merge together. So the reason I'm going on about this is because that really draws attention to the fact that when they do not merge a person with an environment, what codes actually do, we can say, is that they perform boundary work. Yeah, they establish a person's contours and shapes in a specific way. And I want to understand the kinds of relationships and then even obsessive preoccupations that Renaissance people had with outerwear, which explains why they could project quasi-human power such as speech onto it, why men gave each other men's materials for coats very often, scrutinized and spent so much money on them as they turned outerwear into ever more elaborate forms of bodily ornamentation. And my approach uses textual evidence and image analysis to trace how outerwear was perceived at the time. It's also object-based in that it looks at what coats were and what they were made of to reveal what kind of sensations they might have given to wearers. And this, I think, allows us to measure their material vibrancy in shaping central worlds beyond the coat's utility to influence people's interactions. Their creativeness, of course, would have been understood at the time, and we can understand, therefore, the way in which a coat prepared, we might say, a body for the social world by concealing or highlighting body parts, for instance, or by creating a specific fit, and thus an experience of the body in comportment. This leads, I think, then to an anthropological understanding of the close connection of dress displays and identity across cultures, and of the potential of clothes to transform people by making them feel or, in fact, behave differently. A materialist perspective in this way changes our reading of Renaissance style. First, it no longer only focuses on objects now considered fine art, but considers a much wider range of artifacts, including dress. Second, it explores the ways in which social behavior, we might say, was embedded in artifacts and vice versa to reproduce society in ways that often reinforced male elite privilege, but also could subvert or remake conventional cultural norms, as in the creation of the artist as new social type. In today's talk, I will argue that Albrecht Dürer's work and writings are an important part of this much larger story, and I will explore the significance of masculine dress for regimes of recognition by focusing on the artist's letter from Venice, written in the middle of his career. But I want to start also by thanking those who helped me in thinking about this. So Andrew Groves from the Westminster Archive for Menswear, Nabil Ali, Dyer and Gardner, Jenny Tiramani, who gave me a wonderful tutoring session, without which I would have not embarked seriously on thinking about this topic at all, and Sophia Feist, who is among us and will speak tomorrow in the morning. There she is, and who is a trained tailor as well as a PhD student at Cambridge, and did a reconstruction for me. And I also want to highlight the work of two former PhD students that made me think about this topic as well in particular ways. I'm sure we think forthcoming from Oxford University Press, Holly Fletcher's wonderful work on fatness and thinness in early modern Germany and clothes in relation to that, and Anna Parker's work on dress and the household and emotions. And Anna's work made me think particularly about the notion of the transitional object. Albrecht Dürer's life was one of personal and creative departure. His father, a Hungarian immigrant, was an older and respected master craftsman when he trained young Albrecht in goldsmithing. At the age of 13, Dürer rebelled to become a painter. In his late teens, he traveled and worked in printing trades in Basel before returning to Nuremberg, where he married Agnes Frey and set up his own workshop. This marriage was arranged by the parents and improved his social position. Agnes's mother and grandmother were from patrician families, while her father, Hans Frey, was a goldsmith. It was around this time that Dürer created the first freestanding self-portrait in oil by any artist in history. He completed two more at the ages of 26 and 28. Each of these three self-portraits presents us, I think, with a different persona. A young, vulnerable, unmarried man, a confident, even daring a man in carefully coordinated, stylish clothing that are worn in a slightly negligent manner, and a much more modestly dressed man who reaches the age of maturity in the reassuring knowledge that he's created in the image of Christ and possesses an outstanding talent for depicting the world. His writings also reveal a strikingly varied voice, often in a highly personal style. This means that historians, in my view, need to trace these plural voices within Dürer and the social relations to which he responded. Rather than seeing Dürer as a man in control of his own self-fashioning, as some have proposed in the past, we can discover, in my view, the tensions, the ambiguities, anxieties, and pleasures that were part of negotiating this fundamentally new experience of operating as an aspiring, learned, and largely independent artist in an age of extraordinary change, dependent as much on commercial success as a mostly free working freelance artist as on the patronage of rulers when he worked for them, scholars and counselors for recognition and wealth. So inventing a new role for himself as an artist was precisely what Dürer, a son of a craftsman, was trying to do. He argued that the status of the city's most talented craftsmen in Nuremberg should be elevated to those of independent gentlemen. And that's a big ask, obviously. And he dressed accordingly. Refined and unusual coats materialized Dürer's desire to express his independent taste. And that matters so much because it is, of course, independent from the court artist who would have been given a livery by the ruler he worked for. So in this, Dürer was part of a movement. In the mid-15th century, aspiring artists began to seek the patronage of humanists, and these humanists would have told them about what Pliny had written, Pliny the Elder, about the dress of ancient painters. And some of these descriptions really border on the ridiculous. So it's said in Pliny that Famulus, a painter, wore the toga even when mounting a scaffold, while Zeuxis apparently showed his name woven in gold letters into the embroidery of his garments. So that struggle for recognition and visibility is very clear here. But not every great Renaissance artist, of course, followed this trend. Yet we can say that by Dürer's time, modestly dressed star artists were fast becoming the exception to that proved the rule. And the question of social status was linked to a professional rivalry also between the arts. Leonardo da Vinci argued that painters were superior to sculptors because they were well dressed as they sat at an easel, dipping their light brushes into delicate colors. Yeah. So, what's at stake is just the degree to which you work with your hand and with dirt. Dürer himself is very intent on never showing any dirty studio or anything. And we do have Leonardo's inventory of 1504, which really reveals his love of clothes. And I'm just going to show you, I don't really need to show you this, but some slides to remind us of some of the Renaissance velvets that we find in these. So ranging from the velvets with their gold threads to the much lighter but also glossy satin weave silks, and fabrics of this kind, with the new inventions here in the middle, and particularly interesting here, the mixture of linen and silk. So one of the cheaper, but still very interesting garments within the reach of the middle classes. So Leonardo's inventory of 1504 reveals his love of clothes. As outerwear, he leaves a purple satin cloak, a crimson satin cloak tailored in the French manner, so this internationalism becomes important, as well as a pink Catalan gown. So notice the color ranges here: a pink Catalan gown, a dusty rose gown, and a dark purple cloak with a large collar and hood of velvet. So cloaks were anything but prosaic in Albrecht Dürer's day. Mostly known as a gown or Rock in German, they were the most expensive item in a man's wardrobe and were usually made to last. Dyed black, grey, brown, dark green and blue, and sometimes bright yellow, red or purple coats declared taste, ambition and wealth. In length, so up to the 1550s, there were still full cloaks reaching to the floor or knee. Their tailoring and embellishment could be intricate, making them complex artifacts in terms of how their materials were sourced or transformed. In this great age of craft spectatorship, people understood every detail of the coat's manufacture, its peculiarity and thingliness, its maker, and its implication for a life of wearing it. And this was especially true, I think, in the Renaissance, when coats were often not taken off, but were integral to a formal outfit. And the right coat really was essential for access to many social and political gatherings. Its absence was prohibitive, as in you just could not go to an event simply because you didn't have the right cloak. So this meant, as Peter Stalabras has shown, that well into the 19th and 20th centuries, coats were constantly engaged with and related to. They enabled social acts and modes of recognition, and therefore subjectivity, which is why I think we can argue that they materialized a person rather than merely representing them. So that's the difference here in approach, also materialize them rather than representing them. So very, very quickly, a potted history of changes in style. So here we certainly see the sleeve in operation to add volume fabric. And of course, this is embroidered here, extraordinary sleeve lengths here. You can see how sleeves are then varied. They're cut to show fur lining here amongst craftspeople. This gives you a nice sense of, however, the relatively simple construction of many cloaks, still right up to the end of the century. And one of the real, looking at many images in museums over the last year, one of the real turning points seems to me the Duke of El Infantado. If you look at the construction of his cloak there, you see an incredible amount of elaboration at the back with these, of course, the hood and then these strands that come off it. That seems to be showing a very different development, really, by the late 15th century. Why do I associate it so much with male recognition management for the German land? So one of my key arguments here is that if we look at wedding portraits, we of course know that women also received cloaks for weddings, but in almost every wedding portrait, it is the man who's depicted wearing it. And I'm not, you can see in this lecture, going into the intricacies of terminology, but very, very quickly just to say that I'm aware of the fact that the word for coat can also relate to these very close-fitting garments as opposed to gowns and coats. Looking at a Finnish coat from the early 16th century, Renaissance people would notice what shade of color had been created by natural dyes, what fabric and whether wool or shiny silk threads had been used, how sleeves and collars had been constructed, and how pleats and elaborate embroidery had been used, and how much volume had been added overall to create a drape that in turn, of course, changed the way in which a man moved. Elitemen wore coats in all seasons. With the exception of the riding coats, German coats were never fastened at the front, but could usually be taken off and on very quickly. Cheaper furs could be used to line the inside of winter coats for warmth, while more expensive furs were ideal for trimming collars and cuffs. Generously constructed cloaks enveloped the elite. These typically long gowns of the first half of the 16th century gave men, therefore, I think, a unified sense of the body Gestalt. The particular materiality and construction of a coat gave different sensations to wearers and viewers. So volume around the shoulders and pleating, for example, could aggrandize slender men, and build them up into impressive figures. And a wonderful example, and here I also want to thank again, particularly Jenny Romani for discussing these two paintings with me. A particularly instructive here is Hans Mielich's painting of Jakob Fröschel, a grain merchant from the south of Germany, and he married in 1539 when this portrait was commissioned. So the construction of his garment shows how well constructed it was in the first place and how lavish the use of materials. And this contrasts with Dürer's actually simple gown in the self-portrait of 1500, which depicted him, as we saw, as a follower of Christ's humility. Dürer's brown cloak was most likely made of lambskin, the same material he had also portrayed his father as wearing. It was flat cut with no armholes and simply constructed sleeves with a slit, no shoulder seams, no yoke at the shoulders, which, like men's shirts up to this day, of course, increase comfort. Fröschel's gown is carefully tailored to be both roomy and using a yoke at the back to hang well. It is made entirely of a precious pattern silk damask, which required a great deal of fabric to match the pattern on both sides of the body. It has relatively short sleeves, giving a subtle effect of showing a black satin sleeve of the upper garment worn underneath. The merchant's robe is trimmed with guards in a rich and dark black velvet. Its measurements have been calculated to show off this beautiful embroidered shirt at the neck and the cuffs. And here I want to show you Sophia Feist's construction of a burger cloak from a bit later in the century, and she will speak, as I said, about this tomorrow morning. So here we can identify, in a very basic way that, in contrast to what you see earlier as the Van Eyck painting where it depicting how much this complexity has increased and how we can distinguish these different parts that, of course, were then made to use as little fabric as possible when they were cut out. And this is what it looks like when put together. And what we, of course, have to draw attention to as well is that, with a lining, with fur lining, and we see this again through reenactment here, that, naturally, if you had an expensive fur lining, you would move in a way to show this off. This contrasts very nicely with the figure of the outsized, the giant man, as he would have been called. What's interesting there is that the lining in these two fabrics, the velvet and the plain lining, almost makes precisely the point about the incongruity of measurement in that body as well. But even wealthy men would have feared the cost of quality coats in light, fast, deep colors made from the finest fabrics and furs. They did not hesitate, we find, to sell second-hand coats to each other. In addition, if we look at the Nuremberg records, we see that peddlers would have regularly catered to the elites, and we know this from evidence for Venice, of course, as well, and at the markets or door to door. And the contents of wardrobes fluctuated, therefore, over a lifetime, which is why inventory records are to be used with caution. But we know from inventories that one Nuremberg patrician, for example, owned 4 precious gowns when he died in 1506 at the age of 31. And they were colorful and cosmopolitan. 2 yellow coats, one of which was made from Italian velvet, a green one from Bruges. Whereas we might really expect pronounced groupism, we might say, in the kinds of cloaks Renaissance when we're wearing, we find instead striking variety. almost everyone in the streets of Nuremberg owned a coat, and however the value of these wardrobes really changes, or it's very asymmetrical, as you would expect. On the one hand, we have a rich merchant who leaves cloaks at the value of 227 florins, whereas the average value of the cloaks of Nuremberg craftsmen was between 11 and 17, so 227, whereas 11 to 17. The Renaissance can therefore be understood as an aesthetic cultural movement defined in part by the display of clothing, which was skillfully crafted in a variety of ways and mediated one's relationship to society in political, social, gendered, and sensorial ways, and of course racialized ways as well. So we shall see in a moment. Different leathers, weaves, and types of fabrics, as well as dyes, provided specific sensory experiences for the wearer. Of course, many men wore black for their wedding portrait, as we can see, but the range of colors that was fashionable in the early decades of the 16th century was great and driven by that interest in materials manufacture and craft experimentation. Indeed, the period witnessed a modernization, we can say, of sensory worlds as delicate colors, such as pink, and you saw that already in Leonardo's inventory as well, as delicate colors such as pink were explored through clothing, and as trade in a great variety of pigments and knowledge of different dye recipes proliferated. Pink became a fashion color coveted by elegant men. The way in which natural dyes could be obtained encouraged an interest in the interplay of colors, the freshness, intensity, precise hue, and brightness of colors, as they were always transiting as well. Fugitive, not only seen as something necessarily negative, but experienced as that bright flash of color that moved on in an interesting way and was precisely observed at the time. So for artists then in turn, like Dürer, the challenge was really to capture these novel color worlds in dress in their paintings. So here I want to refer to that collaboration with Nabil Ali, and also to a reconstruction that Sophie Pittman, who's here, has undertaken as well. So if we ask ourselves, how was that pink achieved? We can use then at how madder root, but also Brazil wood was used both separately and then together. And we can see this, of course, as a more available dye stuff. Brazil wood, of course, had been available before. Brazil was named after the country, but the supply becomes easier. And in the Plictho, that great dye manual from 1548, you then find already a combined recipe of using both madder and Brazil. This is the kind of range, but I've also brought you a color chart where you can see this in some Brazil wood dye. And I want to draw your particular attention here to the then the sample. Of course, you can see different fabrics that are used, including also leather then. And here, this is the sample where madder and Brazil wood is used together to create a particular intensity. And maybe I'll just so in other words, you can see through that variability why this is such a rich field of experimentation, and why people would have picked up, knowing that all this was created made this is how you achieve this this particular hue. And we see this, so this is what's going round in his reconstruction. And Sophie Pittman has done an orchal reconstruction from the Plictho, where again we get very interesting results, I think, in particular when you can see down here comparing the results of kermes and madder, where the madder on alum silk actually produces a different brightness and intensity in contrast to the kermes, so a bit different to what we might perhaps expect. But, a key point is a range of really wonderful, intense tones of pinks. And we've explored this. This is just to alert you to the imminent publication in October of this book that I co-edited with Jill Dürer and Maria Hayward, and where Sophie Pittman has an excellent article on this reconstruction and the plictho. So Dürer's stay in Venice in 1506 would have immersed him in the experience of color. The merchants on the Rialto Bridge stocked up on plants and minerals used by painters and dyers, so much so that in 1537, the water in the canal was colored when their warehouses were flooded. Dürer's stated artistic aim in Venice was to show the Venetians that he mastered color in his painting. I've shocked the mouths of the painters who said I was good at engraving, but didn't know how to use color in painting, he wrote triumphantly after completing the altarpiece known as the Feast of the Rose Garden. Many knew Dürer and still know him today only as a master of the black line, as a printmaker. Colors, how to make them, how to handle them, how to mix them, were thus central to Dürer's thinking as he stayed in Venice, looking at what people were wearing and thinking about what dyes might have been used to create dress, as he looked at the shops of the color merchants, as he looked at people and their dress, and at paintings at other churches. The Feast of the Rose Garlands was also a feast of color, and reference to masterworks such as Bellini's influential and innovative uses of color in Venice. So this means that by now we've moved to the final part, and I have to ask you to be fully attentive to this heart of the lecture, the final resolving of the puzzle, I think, of why Dürer then animates his coat. But I think this kind of contextualization is necessary to solve this puzzle. All this, I hope, makes it less surprising that Dürer twice wrote to the Nuremberg humanist Pirkheimer from Venice in September 1506 that animated and humanized his outer garments to imply their biography and power, and that he included a portrait. Have you all spotted Dürer already? A portrait of himself in the Feast of the Rose Garlands, for the first time using a sign to identify himself. Everyone spotted him? This is always with Dürer's altar painting, you spot Dürer game. He does this routinely. In the classical rhetorical tradition, which Pirkheimer had studied and Dürer knew, lawyers and politicians were taught how to evoke a memory or give power to a speech by personifying inanimate objects. It is therefore useful to ask conceptually how outer garments constituted and transformed their wearers in relation to them, as an example of how objects contributed to the creation of personhood materially, effectively, and through speech. This turned them into active participants in the experience of being in the world, and thus breaks through a neat categorization of human subjects as different from objects, by arguing for a continuum of perception enveloping both humans and objects without a clear sense of human domination. So Dürer had traveled to Venice in the winter of 1505, and 10 letters he wrote to Pirkheimer in 1506 are extant. He was in his mid-30s, still struggling very much as an artist, and the asymmetry between them, Pirkheimer being a well-known and established patrician, was very marked. So we don't have Pirkheimer's letter, but it's clear that Pirkheimer had started off a kind of jocular exchange that was probably linked to a sexual insult of Dürer, and had something to do with an insult from what he called a Stube, a chamber, and that probably related to the meeting of Nuremberg, the meeting room of Nuremberg patricians. So Dürer responds by telling Pirkheimer that his chamber is a shed, and that he will send olive wood to fumigate the terrible contaminating sexual morals of these men. In his letter of the 8th September 1506 also jokes about Pirkheimer's pride in memorizing these long humanist speeches. And then he moves into two personifications. First, he makes his altarpiece talk and says, my altarpiece says to tell you it would give a ducat for you to see it, it's good, and the colors are beautiful. And then after describing the success of the painting and how it had won him acclaim and silenced his critics, he adds that his French mantle and his brown Italian gown also sent Pirkheimer fervent greetings. And then he ends his next letter on the 23rd of September. This is Pirkheimer. They were contemporaries, just months apart in terms of when they were born. So in September 1506, he complains about his continuing poverty and then adds this final sentence that can be translated in different ways. My French mantle, the hussek, and the brown gown send you warm greetings. But I'd like to know, he comes back to this, what your gentleman's club knows to make it so high and mighty. And I think the repetition of the same reference to outerwear in relation to recognition within 2 letters and 2 weeks certainly points to a mental habit and Dürer's unconscious preoccupations. And I think this interpretation is sanctioned also by a poem, but I will cut the section to save time. But so Dürer's poems are absolutely terrible. They've been looked at very little, and they don't read better in German either. But this is one that responds to a joke by a fellow painter about how is it that you can say that an altar piece sits or stands on an altar, not a great riddle, but it's about how different words connote the same reality. And then he responds to that with another terrible poem in which he first comments on this altarpiece, sitting or standing thing, but then interestingly talks here, and you can read this quickly, in this weird way about this man with a lambskin coat, and again, 2 fellows then wondering, is this a skin, is this a hide? And once more, this is really about a material example that show that different words connote a variety of aspects of an object. But it seems to also point to me again to a mental habit, especially in uncensored jocular contexts. He was involved in thinking about cloaks as material thresholds that announced a man to others. So we can ask, returning to these letters, what were these codes really saying? They were saying, the altarpiece, look at me, how well I made. The code saying, I send greetings. And they drew attention to the fact that they were valuable possessions, spoke to international fashion and to Dürer's dignity. And he clearly considered them memorable and capable of making his absent body presence. And they were different, part of a different form of experience and knowledge, and Dürer demanded their recognition. So again, very quickly, what's interesting about this hussek, he depicts himself as wearing there, and you can also notice his noticeably blonder hair than in the 1500 self-portrait, is that this was associated with Nuremberg in Venice. He seems to have taken it to Venice, and this ethnicized a claim for being, as he calls himself, on that piece of painting of text in an Albrecht Dürer Germanus, being a northern painter in Italy. And you can also see that the construction with that open front clearly differs from Venice. And all this time, we have to bear in mind that he's negotiating his status constantly. Very famously, he declares that at home, I'm a parasite. Here in Venice, he writes in the last letter, I was a gentleman. So constantly trying to gain greater definition, but saying to Pirkheimer, you won't want to hang out with me, joking, when I'm back in Nuremberg as a painter. So let me conclude. As Peter Partial notes in Dürer's 1514 print Melancholia 1, various categories of objects lie scattered on the floor in studied disorder. Among the inanimate objects, there are a number relating to quantifications. There are also construction tools Other objects suggest various kinds of material and immaterial transformation. The engraving, and I think this is a wonderful sentence, the engraving not only encourages the making of lists, it is largely composed of them. Dürer emphasized the feminized melancholic's inability to grasp, order, and arrange such an object world. It turned into a trapped mental state, leading to physical immobility. The outer garment in which one moved, on the other hand, could facilitate a Renaissance artist's bodily schema of completeness and coherence, which, mediated by touch, allowed a different sense of self to go out and face the world in its multiple possibilities of recognition. And this explains, I think, the extent to which Dürer could identify with his coats and the extent to which outerwear formed an agentive nexus at the time. Alfred Gell's conceptualization of the nexus cautions us to move from the question of what an object might symbolize or represent to what objects might actually do in their world. And this is what I've tried to show to you today with this talk about Dürer's animations of his coats, but also our use of reconstruction to help animate them in turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for kicking off our festival so wonderfully. It was brilliant, brilliant that. I think we do have time for a few questions, if anybody.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I have questions about colour and the colour that was used to paint the cloaks in art, and then the colours that were used to dye fabric. And I was wondering if there were shared colours there and how representative, you know, the colours in art are what was being drawn. I know you said, I mean, obviously black is like a very common one, but then there's all these colours. And yeah, I just have, wondering if you could elaborate.
It's a great question because, you know, the connection is so intimate through lakes. So lake pigments are actually derived from soaking fabrics and taking the dye out of them. And again, you know, Venice was very much a place to be. So absolutely close to, so the church in which he painted was close to the Rialto market where all these color merchants were, but also where what's called the Parangan happened. So this was a kind of very interestingly orchestrated sale of the richest silk garments. And also, you know, as Filippo Di Vivo has shown an amazing article, the thing about Venice is, of course, that everybody is walking. And if you read the diary of Martina Sanudo, you can see this, you know, this everybody observes. So nobody's sitting high up on a horse. Everybody observes these goats. So I think the, you know, the connection there is very, very clear. This intense environment of observing close of what the pigments they made from and then painting. You know, Venice is associated with the color painting and making these different pigments that allow you to capture what is going on in the streets all the time.
Well, thank you so much for an incredibly rich talk. Could you just give us 2 minutes on the construction of Dürer's cloak in the Rose Garden? It's so interesting that it's all, there's so many uniforms in that painting, which I hadn't noticed before. The Venetian aristocratic cloak, the papal garments. And you mentioned that this is a Nuremberg cloak. What's going on in it?
Yes, so this is a bit I cut out, but you're absolutely right to say that, you know, that just looking at this, the range here is really instructive, and of course, in terms of make as well. So what I love, for instance, about the depiction of the papal vestment is that you can see it's got a completely different drape. Why has it got such a different drape? And because it's stiff, it's absolutely stiff with gold and silver metal thread. Yeah, that's why, well, you know, he's really captured that. So in terms of his own Husek, you can see that it's of course got quite a large fur here, which we think is marten fur. So that, you know, there is the one thing about this rose garland painting, which you can see in Prague, is that it's regarded as one of these complete conservation dramas and tragedies. So, you know, it is always with some caution that we can talk about it. And we do have a copy from the early 17th century of the rose garland painting when it was taken out of that Venetian church and transported over the Alps, of course, spectacular, to the court of Rudolf II, which is why it's now in Prague. So, and that does give slightly different colors, but not so much for that Hussek. And what stands out about it is, of course, then the use of these velvet trimmings around the edge of the collar, and then along the sleeves. So again, if you think about it in terms of attractive signaling and thinking about human and animal worlds and the way in which attractive signaling or camouflage is used there, again, you see in the context of that painting how that completely stands out. And front is open, it's quite generous as well. So that's what I would say about it there. But you know, clearly, completely, he would have stood out by wearing this in Venice at the time.
I have a question from online. A question from Kate Swan asking, I'm curious whether the orchilla you mentioned is extracted from lichens. She's come across many references to this in her research on Irish dress of the same period, and would like to know if you found it in yours.
Yes, so there's, you know, it is a lichen. I mean, we have to really think about it as linked to conquest in this period. So the conquest of the Canary Islands is absolutely linked with the extraction of lichen in quite dramatic ways, because that's where lichen is supposed to give particularly good eyes. These are these kind of mosses that are bonded, you know, over centuries of growth to rocks, and they're literally scraped off, and there's great trade in them, which you know, through this greater availability there, not just Brazil but also lichen, means that if you look at Paula Hotti's work, we can see even craftspeople again wearing these light purples that they often make as well. Yes, so it is derived from lichen.
The material threshold of the cloak, and I was wondering about its physicality, because it's sort of a social skin, but it's also a protective skin clothing beneath. So how do those two things interact, especially in the case of delicate color?
Yeah, that's a great question, which I haven't thought about yet. Would you have any thoughts on it?
I guess I was sort of wondering about the concept of a Nuremberg patricia having 4 cloaks, and how kind of these different social skins be applied based on the physical. Whether there are occasions when sort of heavier materials are called for, light materials, whether there might even be sort of overcloaks.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. You know, that's really, you know, the way to approach this question, which is a very good one. And of course, you know, that's where, you know, the density of weaves, in relation to, you know, again, you know, how it makes you feel, the type of